It's becoming increasingly clear that President Joe Biden's infrastructure proposal, the same bill that led to comical comparisons to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, is actually rapidly devolving into a Trojan horse for privatization and the transfer of more wealth from American workers to corporate executives. Biden reached a deal with, a vague infrastructure deal with a group of bipartisan senators following a failed round of negotiations with a separate group of GOP lawmakers. The president's subsequent press conference announcing the deal was brief and really void of any detail.
And to answer your direct question, we have a deal. And I think it's really important. We've all agreed that none of us got what we wanted. I clearly didn't get all I wanted. They gave more than I think maybe they were inclined to give in the first place. But this reminds me of the days we used to get an awful lot done up in the United States Congress. We actually worked with one. We had bipartisan deals. Bipartisan deals mean compromise.
Now, based on the recent cheery headlines celebrating that the president had miraculously reached a deal in the spirit of bipartisanship, one might think that the era of neoliberal austerity and gridlock in Congress is coming to an end. But in reality, things are actually shaping up to get a lot worse. The bill has now been slimmed down to a pathetic $570 billion in new spending, and it will redirect unused state and local coronavirus relief funds for a total budget of $1.2 trillion over the next 8 years. As the New York Times reports, it would include some existing infrastructure programs, but also provide, as I mentioned, $579 billion in new money over 8 years to patch cracking highways, rebuild crumbling bridges, speed rail traffic, and more equitably spread high-speed internet access. So basically, this bipartisan deal, although we haven't seen the language of it yet, is exactly what GOP lawmakers in the Senate wanted. They did not want any of the social programs like childcare funding or elder care funding, education funding. They don't want any of that stuff. And so they apparently succeeded in getting that cut out. And obviously, this $1.2 trillion figure, which only provides $579 billion in new funding, is far less than the $2.25 trillion that Biden had called for in his initial plan. Now, look, obviously, Republicans are claiming that they're concerned about the deficit. I would argue that they don't care about the deficit at all. They certainly didn't care about it when they cut government revenue to the tune of $2 trillion by passing Trump's 2017 tax cuts for the rich. Now, the positive parts of Biden's infrastructure bill that have now been cut out of this bipartisan agreement is apparently going to be passed in the future through a separate bill. And so Biden very briefly touches on that in this next clip.
Republicans and this group did not want to go along with any of my family plan issues, the child care tax credits, the human infrastructure that I talk about. And that we'll see what happens in a reconciliation bill in the budget process. If we get some compromise there, and if we can't, see if I can attract all the Democrats to a position.
I mean, I'm skeptical of that. I think anyone who's been paying attention to how the Democratic Party operates should also be skeptical. And maybe when Nando rejoins me, we can talk about, what his predictions are in regard to the possibility of a separate bill with all of these great social programs passing through reconciliation, which would only require a simple majority in the Senate. I mean, that would mean that you would still need to convince corporate Democrats, conservative Democrats, whatever you want to label them as, people like Senator Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, Mark Warner, some of these corporate Democrats, you'd have to convince them to vote in favor of all the things that are actually very unpopular among corporate lawmakers, both on the left and the right. Now, with that said, though, since Republican lawmakers refuse to support any new tax increases for the rich or their corporate buddies, both parties are actually now considering finding the money, the revenue to pay for these infrastructure projects through privatization. And what they did is they released a list of possible pay-fors. And among that list, you'll see something known as asset recycling. So that is $100 billion in public infrastructure that could be sold off to private capital because lawmakers don't want to raise taxes on the rich. According to Bloomberg, asset recycling, which is said to have been first introduced in Australia, allows the government to sell and lease infrastructure such as roads, airports, and utilities to private companies and use the profits to develop new infrastructure without incurring new debt. Look, this effort did not play out well in Australia. In fact, 2 years after they implemented asset recycling, or P3, as it's oftentimes called, it was ended. The project ended in 2016 because of how horrific it was. An Australian Senate committee said it was, quote, concerned about the possibility that incentives under the asset recycling initiative may encourage privatization without effective public consultation and communication strategies, and without appropriate consideration or analysis of future costs. And oftentimes, when we privatize public infrastructure, people are told that it's actually going to be far more cost effective, but the data does not bear that out. And I will get to that later with some evidence, with some receipts to make my case. It turned out, by the way, that the government was just, in Australia, was just privatizing public infrastructure and then doing nothing with the money, the private capital that they received through the sale of the public infrastructure. And so a year out, in some cases, reporters would reach out to government officials and ask them, cool, I mean, the whole point of privatizing infrastructure was that you guys would then gain the revenue necessary to direct that funding to other infrastructure projects. What are you guys spending the money on? And Australian lawmakers were like, we haven't really thought about that much. So they did end that program 2 years later. There were a host of other issues that we're likely to experience through the privatization of various parts of our public infrastructure. Now, Scott Lundlam, who is a Green Party senator from Western Australia, protested that privatization bill before it went into effect. His statements are foreshadowing of what the American public can expect should the Biden administration go forward with $100 billion in infrastructure privatization. Watch.
This bill, to put it as plainly as I can, is about bribing state and territory governments to sell off public assets in order to obtain Commonwealth funding. So we will be urging Labor to join with the Greens and vote the bill down, which would, among other things, create a slush fund for toll roads at the expense of investment in public transport.
Oh yeah, toll roads. Now it's time to talk about the very specific consequences that average Americans are going to face as the federal government sells off public infrastructure. There are several issues with asset recycling, and I want to be clear. Asset recycling, public-private partnership, P3, it's all the same thing. So I might use them interchangeably, but understand it's the same result, essentially taking public infrastructure and privatizing it. Now, the first thing I want to focus on is the redistribution of wealth, a trend that we've been experiencing in the United States for decades now. And it's the redistribution of wealth from the very bottom to the very top. That is what we're going to experience under this privatization effort. And think about it. The only reason private capital would be invested in these types of public infrastructure projects is if they viewed it, if these private companies viewed it as a lucrative investment. Remember, they're doing this because they want a return on their investment. So maximize gains, minimize losses. And as David Dayen wrote in the American Prospect, there are only two ways for these companies to reduce ownership and operation costs below what the public sector would spend while still being profitable. They can cut back either on safety or labor or maintenance, or they can extract a lot of profit from users of the infrastructure. Think toll roads. In fact, to help us think about toll roads, let's see how Americans feel about them in parts of the country that have already implemented this so-called public-private partnership model.
Virginia is a big believer in public-private partnerships and points to successes like the express lanes here along the Beltway, where a driver can choose to pay a toll to get around congestion. They say it's been a big success, but those successes have come with some costly mistakes. Every time you get into your car, it's like ka-ching, ka-ching.
Totally.
Linda Dyer's daily commute is taking a toll. Whenever she leaves home, she's paying to use tunnels that used to be free. Now she's thinking about moving elsewhere.
We're spending $1,200 a year in tolls.
Yeah, and my biggest concern is it going to affect how easy it is for me to sell my house.
Virginia agreed to a 58-year deal with a private company to modernize and expand the tunnels linking Portsmouth and Norfolk, two military towns separated by the Elizabeth River. The tolls to cross can run a driver $5.25 each way.
Do you just get mad when you're driving through that tunnel?
Yes, I do.
She gets mad, and I don't blame her. I mean, when you think about it, you're going to privatize these highways, these roads, these bridges, and the private companies operating them are going to try to find a way to maximize their profit through individuals using the infrastructure. So the toll roads really do get out of control. In fact, Virginia should have learned from the failures of a similar public-private partnership infrastructure project that was done in the 1990s.
The first modern public-private partnership was Denver's Highway E470, opened in 1991 by 8 counties and a consortium of builders and financiers without a cent of public funding. It was innovative, one of the first large toll highways to go completely cashless. It's also one of the priciest roads in America, costing drivers as much as 39 cents per mile.
I mean, it's the same as taking a taxi to and from work every day. Think about how much of a regressive tax that really ends up being. And speaking of regressive taxation, when Biden initially proposed his infrastructure plan, he claimed that it would be funded by, or the financial burden would be carried by wealthy people, individuals making more than $400,000 a year. And he also proposed to increase the corporate tax from 21% to 28%, even though it was 35% before the Trump tax cuts for the rich went into effect. He claimed, and still claims, that he rejects the regressive taxation options that have been floated by Republican lawmakers, things like a gas tax, for instance, or a highway tax. He's like, no, we're going to reject that. We're not in favor of that. We want to make sure that working Americans, average Americans, don't bear the financial burden of these infrastructure projects. But in reality, in a very roundabout way, if Biden agrees to privatizing public infrastructure, those regressive taxes will be implemented anyway. But it's not a regressive tax that provides revenue to the federal government. It's a regressive tax that provides revenue specifically to private corporations, which is why this is just another scheme to redistribute wealth, whatever's left of it, from the bottom to the very top in this country. It is a complete disastrous idea. And the fact that it's even being considered by Democrats gives you a sense of just how similar both parties are when it comes to appeasing their corporate overlords. Now, I also want to talk about the other talking point that you're likely to hear from proponents of this public-private partnership or asset recycling. Now, in order to get the public on board, oftentimes what you'll hear from these private corporations or proponents of these programs is that it's an efficient way to build infrastructure and to cut costs associated with buildings infrastructure. But the data does not, in fact, bear that out. There's actually been an abundance of data indicating that that talking point has been disproven. In fact, a 2018 UN report found that while privatization's proponents insist that it saves money, enhances efficiency, and improves services, the real world evidence very often challenges or contradicts these claims. In terms of costs, private finance is more expensive than public finance, and public-private partnerships can also incur high design, management, and transactional costs due to their complexity and the need for external advice. Listen, we see that here in California, where voters overwhelmingly agreed to raise their own taxes in order to provide the funding for, these supposedly affordable housing developments. What ended up happening is these developers who were contracted by local lawmakers, what they did was essentially just inflate the cost, the building costs for these affordable housing units. It's just the same thing happens, not just here in the United States, but across the world where these public-private partnerships take place. Also, it's important to look at specific examples of how these infrastructure projects can end up costing a lot more than they need to. We have so many case studies to show, including what you're about to watch in this video.
Private dollars are not a substitute for public dollars. And we're not going to be able to solve all our issues simply by having public-private partnerships be the only answer.
That's because these deals often end badly for the public. In Texas, the company that built a toll road from Dallas to Austin went bankrupt in less than a decade before it could repay millions in federal loans. And in Chicago, a 75-year Morgan Stanley-led lease on all of the city's parking meters has cost the city millions. In Virginia, you don't have to go far to find a project that bombed. In 2011, a company called Elizabeth River Crossings won a contract to upgrade tunnels connecting the naval town of Norfolk with the working-class city of Portsmouth. The company makes its profit from tolls, which started small, but now reach as high as $11.
Good afternoon, fellow Rotarians and guests.
It's discouraged people from using the tunnels, and Portsmouth locals say it's hurting the city.
Portsmouth is a commuter city for workers who come to us. These tolls of, $800, $900 a year have an impact on them.
So it has a domino effect on communities, especially when you have roads that are just far too expensive for individuals to use. And honestly, while researching this story, there were just too many examples of how these public-private partnerships were wasteful. How these so-called efficient private companies actually ended up not being efficient at all and went bankrupt. And the privatization of public infrastructure not only ends up costing more to complete the project itself due to inflated costs, but sometimes the tolls, these toll roads, end up being so financially burdensome for workers that the government has to step in and subsidize the tolls as well.
Many in this working-class community couldn't afford their commute, forcing the state to pony up nearly $300 million extra dollars to buy down the tolls.
Meaning that we could have done that project ourselves.
So that project just was a loser.
Great transportation project that needed to be done. The infrastructure absolutely was needed. The way we financed it was not such a great deal for the Commonwealth of Virginia.
So how is that efficient? I mean, how is it efficient to essentially sell off public infrastructure to private companies who then obviously mismanage the project, in this case, implement insanely expensive tolls to the point where the local officials have to get involved and provide more resources to subsidize the tolls so people in the community could actually afford to use the roads. I mean, this is the direction that we're headed in with this infrastructure bill, which, again, going back to all of these ridiculous headlines comparing Biden to FDR. I mean, yes, did FDR in some through the New Deal offer opportunities for private companies to join forces with the public in order to execute some infrastructure projects? Yes. But this essentially puts it on steroids because it's just taking public infrastructure and privatizing it, allowing these private companies to do with it what they will. Since they have a profit motive, they're not actually going to invest the resources necessary to improve the infrastructure. There's also a likelihood, by the way, that as soon as they obtain all this infrastructure, they're going to have clearly a vested interest to lobby Congress to deregulate various codes and building regulations. That's another thing to be concerned about. And we've seen similar things happen with other privatization models, like for-profit prisons, for instance. How did that turn out for us? Now, the final thing I want to mention is the fact that Biden, through being open to this, is walking back one of his main talking points, one of his most important selling points in getting the public to support this infrastructure bill. The infrastructure bill is not titled Biden's infrastructure bill. It's titled the American Jobs Plan, because the whole point here was not just to improve infrastructure, but to create well-paying unionized jobs. But if you sell off public infrastructure to private companies, which have a profit motive, which is why they're investing their private capital into these projects, you think that they're going to hire well-paid unionized labor to do the work? Of course not. And that's the other thing that Biden has walked back his promise on. And it's infuriating, it's frustrating, because it started off as a decent infrastructure bill. Now we've gotten everything important taken out of it, which allegedly will be part of a reconciliation bill, a separate bill. And then on top of it, instead of raising taxes on the rich, we're now having a discussion about selling off our public goods. It's disgusting, it's wrong, and it's something that I want to talk to Nando about. So Nando.
Yeah, I mean, how quickly reality just kind of slaps you in the face, right? I mean, there was like, I wouldn't say like hope in the early days of the Biden administration. I mean, his foreign policy was always awful, but there was like this sense that maybe a lot of the orthodoxies of the Democratic Party had begun to wither away, that maybe the effect of, the Sanders phenomenon had some effect, and that, the failures of Obama had been sort of understood by some Democrats, even if they were even on some cynical level. But like, just how quickly, as soon as the rubber hits the road, it just snaps back into place. This like awful idea of like public-private partnerships. I mean, that word should be banned forever. I mean, the basic principle is like, yeah.
Let me just say something about that, because what I found super fascinating through researching this was that public-private partnership was the dominant way of describing or naming what this is. And then the government and these corporations realized how unpopular this is, because we've already implemented it to some degree in the US and people hate it. So then they switched it to P3, and people aren't stupid. They caught on, and now they refer to it as asset recycling, which, by the way, I think asset recycling, even though it's the same thing, it sounds worse. Like, it just sounds worse. But
yeah, I mean, the way for people to understand this as like simply as possible is, if it's private, then there's profit. Someone has to make money off of it, like that's the point. So, and if there's profit, that's the most important thing, like when you're introducing the profit motive trumps every single other consideration, always, forever. If it's public, there's examples of corruption, yes, and some public officials get rich off of like corrupt public deals and whatever. But if it's public, the point is not to make money. The point of the whole thing is not for someone to make money. It is to provide a public benefit. Are there ways, better and worse ways to do that? Yes, but the principle remains. Private means that they have to make profit above all other considerations, all like literally like any other public health, the actual point of like an infrastructure of moving things around. You see this a lot in the airline industry. You see it in any sort of public thing that should be a public utility that is privatized. So like, just always be on the lookout for that. Like, it's just a straight giveaway to people, to private interests who need to make money. It's just that's the only way to think about it. And this idea that they're gonna pass like the second thing on budget. I mean, we'll just call up the Senate parliamentarian. And
totally.
And
I mean, they took out everything that like people like Manchin were protesting, and they say they're going to pass it through a reconciliation bill, but they need to get Manchin and Democratic lawmakers like him on board, and they're not on board. So they're not going to pass that. Things are looking really bad for the infrastructure bill. There's no question. And one other thing I want to add before we bring on our guest is these asset recycling deals can be done in different ways, but the way that they're planning on implementing this is they don't just give the federal government capital and then be done with it. No, they do it in the form of a loan with interest. And so they do it so they can lease the public property and manage it. And so while the government is paying them back on this loan, right, they're using the public infrastructure as if it's their private property and, you know, implementing tolls, doing what they can to basically extract money from it, right? And so that's the other thing. Like, it's such a bad deal all around for ordinary Americans, for the government. But hey, we can't raise taxes on the rich. That would just, that would be awful. Just absolutely awful to do that.